Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Stranger Things Season 2. In this video, I review Season 2 of Stranger Things as a whole, so I have to start with a spoiler warning for Season 2 of Stranger Things. If you haven't seen all of Season 2, you will not want to watch this video. Otherwise, some things might be spoiled for you. So, I enjoyed Season 1 of Stranger Things, but perhaps not as much as most people, as there were a lot of hype surrounding it. And personally, I felt the amount of praise and accolades that it was receiving was disproportionate to how good it actually was. In other words, I thought it was overrated. I did really like it, but I thought it relied too heavily on nostalgia and emulated its inspirations a bit too closely, and thus wasn't very original. In addition, I found it kind of fizzled out at the end, and the ending wasn't as satisfying as I was hoping it would be, and it didn't really live up to the great setup. So given that, I was curious of what I would think of Season 2. As the reviews started pouring in, critics and audiences seemed to be split on which was better, Season 1 or Season 2. They all pretty much agreed that Season 2 was good, but the divide seemed to come when comparing it to Season 1. Some people thought it was an improvement on Season 1, while others thought it fell a bit short of Season 1. Now, I was really curious as to where I would fall on this, as I thought it would be possible that because I thought Season 1 was overrated, that maybe I wouldn't hold Season 2 up as high of a standard as many others were, so that would make me appreciate Season 2 better. But on the other hand, maybe I would also think Season 2 was also overrated, and they were both overrated, so perhaps that would make me like Season 1 better. But after having watched it, I can comfortably say I fall on the side that believes Season 2 is better than Season 1. And there are several reasons for this, but the one, part of the problems being that there was two problems I stated about Season 1 and what held that back, and that being that it relied too much on nostalgia and that the ending wasn't very satisfying. While I felt Season 2 corrected both of these issues, while at the same time keeping the quality that made Season 1 good, so the result was a much better and more solid season. So let me address the first issue first, and that is relying too much on nostalgia. Now, don't get me wrong, Season 2 still played heavily on nostalgia. It wouldn't really be Stranger Things if it didn't, but I believe it did so in such a way that was more original, as the nostalgia in Season 2 had more to do with like side dressing here and there, and not the main plot as it did in Season 1, as the main plot in Season 1 was very derivative of E.T. and Stephen King films like Firestarter, whereas in Season 2 the main plot felt a lot more fresh and original, and thus the season overall didn't have that feeling that I've already seen it before like it did in Season 1. Now, don't get me wrong, there were still elements in Season 2 that were very obvious callouts to other properties like The Exorcist, The Empire Strikes Back, or Aliens, but this felt more like small inspirations and callouts which we see in many great movies, and there's nothing wrong with that as long as it's just elements that builds along a more original plot, which I believe it was in Season 2 but not so much in Season 1. So then there's the second element, the ending, which in Season 1 I felt was a huge letdown. It did seem to kind of just fizzle out, whereas in Season 2 the ending was amazing and arguably the best part of the season. Now, I've heard some that don't prefer Season 2 say that the second half of the season was more interesting than the first half, as the first couple episodes weren't that compelling. However, that is something I personally would refer to as good pacing. I talk about this in other videos. People tend to judge serialized shows like an episodic television show, where they look at each episode individually, but I would argue that is the wrong way to judge shows like this, especially ones that air on Netflix and are released all at once, as these shows should be judged as a whole, as one story told over multiple parts. So, rather than each individual episode requiring a beginning, middle, and end, you judge the season as a whole as having a beginning, middle, and end. And in those terms, Season 2 far excelled over Season 1. In fact, I would argue the pacing of Season 2 was much better than Season 1, which is part of the reason why I prefer Season 2. But actually, there is a third reason on why I prefer Season 2, and that's because Season 2 tends to avoid cliches more. For example, the big government bad guy in Season 1 was Matthew Modine's character that came off as the stereotypical government bad guy that we've seen a million times before. However, this year, the head government guy was Paul Reiser's character, who was a lot more dynamic than that. He wasn't a typical good guy, and he wasn't a typical bad guy. You totally bought him as a government official trying to toe the line, and thus in some ways was a real asshole and a hindrance. However, in other ways he came off as a real life human being who could sympathize with Harper and didn't just want to let young children die. This, in fact, in the end, ends up being a real asset to the heroes of the show, and I don't think this is him being a stereotypical good guy, nor did I find this turn unbelievable. I thought it fit perfectly into this character, and thus it was a real asset to the show. And another example of this is the character of Bob, played by Sean Astin, who at first comes off as this stereotypical dorky, useless, stepdad stereotype character. And although he did definitely remain dorky, they took his character in unexpected places by having him be the hero and save everyone with his computer knowledge. And you got the sense that he genuinely cared about Joyce and her children and wasn't just some deadbeat replacement dad. And more importantly, he got to demonstrate this by saving everyone, which made his death more tragic and more meaningful, and thus having this character ended up having really huge impact on the show. However, to be fair, there was one aspect of this where Season 1 was actually better than Season 2, and that's with the character of Billy, Max's brother, who was a walking, talking bully cliche whom I did not like at all. I found this character a lame attempt to create a human villain, and thought his whole storyline was rather pointless and a distraction. Now, granted, they did try to flesh out his character more by showing how abusive his father was, and thus you can see why he takes out his frustration on others, and I did like that, but I still don't think it excuses this cliched character or makes his involvement any more necessary. Whereas in Season 1, they could have went the same direction with Steve, but instead they avoided those cliches by making him an actual dynamic character. But with Billy, it seems like they created him in order to double back on their mistake and actually make it. In any event, looking back on it, I'm actually surprised that at the end of Season 1 I felt that the story should have ended there, and I couldn't possibly see how they could do a sequel without it feeling tacked on. But this didn't seem tacked on at all. It felt like its own complete story. In fact, I'd even go as far to say that someone could watch the season without having seen Season 1 and still be able to follow it enough to enjoy and understand it, and I feel that's a testament to how complete and perfectly paced this season was, as it told the story of Will being possessed by the Mind Flayer monster from another dimension that is using its minions to take over our dimension. Now, the possession story with Will, I thought, did really work, even though at times it was a bit too derivative of The Exorcist. But for the most part, I thought it worked well to add to the tension, especially when they learned whenever they hurt the upside-down creatures, they also hurt Will, which added a nice dynamic to it because it sort of hindered them in the way. And also, the spy aspect was super exciting and made for an amazing cliffhanger when they found out Will was being used by the Mind Flayer to deceive the army guys and set traps for them, so I thought that added an amazing dynamic to the season. Now, I know a lot of people complained about Eleven's storyline this year, as she was for the most part separate from the main action and not directly involved with the group of young kids as she was last season. And to be honest, I wasn't the biggest fan of this at first either, as they explored this relationship with Hopper and trying to be a father figure to her, which I felt came out of nowhere and was just an excuse to keep Hopper relevant to the main story. I was particularly irritated by the episode in which Eleven went to reunite with Mike and saw him talking to Max and mistakenly thought he was interested in her and then just ran off. That was a bit cliched and frustrating, as it felt like a contrived way to keep these two characters apart. However, all that being said, by the end of the season, I was completely satisfied by the way they handled this. In fact, I was thankful for the fact that they kept Eleven separate this whole time, as that made the ending where she finally reunited with Mike so much more powerful. In addition, I thought they really made her character, her relationship with Harper work, as well as there were some really nice moments between them, especially in the final episode where Harper opened up to her about his own daughter. It really made their whole storyline make sense and overall work very well. So now, I have to talk about the episode in which some may disagree with me and refer to it as a bad episode with bad pacing, as I heard many complaints about episode 7, The Lost Sister, but I actually had no problem with it. In fact, I actually really liked this episode and thought it worked. And typically, I don't like when a show ends one episode on a cliffhanger and then they have the next episode be a flashback or dealing entirely with another character that doesn't address the cliffhanger at all. However, in this case, I think it's an exception that actually really works. For one, it sets up nicely by having the final 2 episodes deal with this cliffhanger, and so that brings us to the finale. And for another thing, the Netflix method of releasing the entire season at once changes the dynamic of it. As if it had been released week to week, I could see this being very frustrating, but because you can binge it and plow right through to the next episode, it's one of the great things about Stranger Things is that it's aware it's a Netflix show and is in fact made to be binged. As for the episode itself, I did think this added to Eleven's character nicely and really helps expand the world. Some people saw it as a distraction. I heard one person refer to it as a pilot for a spinoff show, but I totally and completely disagree. I thought of it more as like a setup for season 3, because it does tie into the larger history of Eleven's past and the larger story, and I for one thought it was great to see it expanded upon, and I do think that this will be touched on more again in season 3. Moreover, it added to the overall story of Eleven trying to find herself and become human again, which I loved and overall thought worked really well through the season overall. And the character of her sister is another example of the season avoiding cliches, as she could have came off as a typical cliche bad influence, like bad seed that turned out to be evil. And yes, I mean, she kind of was to a degree, but not completely, as she was more dynamic than that. And most importantly, her sisterly love for Eleven turned out to be genuine, and I love how they did that. So I totally disagree with the haters of this episode, and I loved it and in fact would call it great pacing. We also get introduced to the new character of Max, whom I heard some others complain about as, they felt this character was tacked on and out of place. But again, I totally disagree. I thought she added a nice dynamic to this group and in a way served almost as a replacement for Eleven, which I believe is what Dustin and Lucas wanted, as they missed having that extra element to their group. But it's also why Mike was so resistant, because he didn't want Eleven to be replaced. And she wasn't. Max added a different dynamic to the group, and I liked how she was introduced as this phantom figure that beat them all at these video games. I thought she worked very well as the typical outsider type who then fit in nicely with our group of outcasts. And although I didn't like her brother, I did think they did a great job of creating an interesting and believable backstory for her, which did help add dynamic to this character and help her feel like she wasn't just a gimmicky add-on, which I don't think she was at all. And then there was the storyline with Dustin finding a little baby Demogorgon dog thingy, which of course they didn't realize what it was at first, but it should have been really obvious that it was from the Upside Down and therefore dangerous. And so I did find this a bit cliche how Dustin formed this bond with it, and I predicted that he would see it as a grown-up demi-dog and that it would remember him and so spare his life. So that was really cheesy and predictable, and yet I still couldn't help but like this storyline anyways. Despite its predictability and cheesiness, something about it still really worked, and I couldn't help but think of it as cute. And it was effectively creepy when it turned into a demi-dog and ate Dustin's cat. That did freak me the hell out. And finally, let me end on another storyline I was a bit iffy about, but thought it overall worked. And that was the whole storyline about Barb's parents. As I have not a single solitary doubt in my mind that this storyline would have never existed, or at least not have focused as much on Barb as it did, has it not been for this internet meme or internet campaign about justice for Barb, which frankly was just a fad. And the fact that the Emmys even went as far as to nominate the actress who played Barb just because of this campaign internet fad was ridiculous, and does prove to me once and for all that the Emmys are nothing but a big, humongous joke. So on principle, I'm against them creating an entire storyline on an internet meme, but on the other hand, I do think it was handled nicely, and frankly the fact that no one seemed to care about Barb's death in season 1 was a flaw in that season, so it was great to see that rectified here. I actually thought it led to really great character story with Nancy, as she was haunted by the fact of having to lie to Barb's parents as they prepared to throw away their life savings in order to look for someone that Nancy knew was actually dead. And it's the government people who were preventing her from speaking the truth, which led to an amazing storyline with Nancy and Jonathan tricking these government people so they could take them and then leak it to this reporter guy, who was, by the way, a hilarious character. I loved their scenes with him and how he instantly knew releasing the tape in its entirety wouldn't work, and thus they came up with this plan to water the story down to make it more believable, but at the same time exposing these government people and giving Barb's parents the peace of mind that they deserved. And it was a nice touch that he was able to see that Nancy and Jonathan had this connection, even if they themselves denied it. It was a very funny scene. And so, yeah, I did like the funeral scene at the end where Barb's parents finally got peace, or they finally got justice for Barb, so to speak. But I still see it as a negative that the show gave in to an internet meme, but that's just me. So my rating for Stranger Things Season 2 out of 10 is a 9. Excellent. Even though I had a few nitpicky issues with the show here and there, overall I was really impressed with how much of an improvement this was over Season 1, how they managed to avoid a lot of the stereotypical cliches and all too obvious nostalgia call-outs of Season 1, and managed to tell a much better constructed and better paced season that built up to an amazingly intense ending that did not at all disappoint. In fact, the coda at the end with them all at the dance, I have to say, was a really nice touch and a great way to end the story. And if I'm being honest, I have to admit I did get a little teary-eyed at that. So overall, I thought this was a really engaging and nicely crafted season. So that's it for my review of Stranger Things Season 2. Be sure to check out my channel as I do many other videos on other shows like Game of Thrones, Star Trek, Mr. Robot, The Expanse, Discovery, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. Thanks a lot for watching.